He was born Norman Eugene Walker in the quiet town of Hartford, Illinois, long before the spotlight ever found him. Raised through the weight of the Great Depression, Clint Walker's early world was one of cold mornings, worn shoes, and the kind of discipline you don't outgrow. His hands bore the marks of factory labor and riverboat ropes before ever holding a script. Hollywood wasn't a dream back then. It was distant, almost unreal. Yet something about him stood out, even in silence. At 6'6", with a voice that settled like dust on desert wind, he carried a presence that made others stop and watch. Those early jobs, the drifting years, the uniform worn during the war, they weren't detours. They were shaping something deeper. Before the fame, before the cowboy hat, before the camera ever rolled, there was a man simply trying to build a life. Each mile of that journey mattered. And none of it would be left behind. Because when the spotlight finally did land on him, it didn't change the man, it revealed him. Slowly, quietly, a legacy began to form. It was 1955 when the world finally caught up with Clint Walker. Cheyenne didn't just introduce a new television hero. It marked the arrival of a different kind of masculinity. Rugged, yes, but grounded. Strong, but never boastful. Week after week, viewers returned not just for the action, but for the man behind it. Something in his stillness spoke louder than dialogue. Over 8 seasons, his portrayal of Cheyenne Bodie became more than a role. It became a mirror for a generation looking for courage and conscience. But even as his fame rose, so did the distance from the man he once was. Hollywood offered him bright lights, yet he never truly let go of the quiet roads that led him there. Beneath the fame, the story was still unfolding, full of twists, private griefs, and moments the public never saw. That chapter may be over, but it shaped everything. And even now, years after the screen faded to black, the echoes of Clint Walker's journey still carry weight. Clint Walker's rise wasn't overnight. It was a slow climb through grit, silence, and discipline. When Cheyenne arrived on American television, it didn't just launch a series. It launched a symbol. Clint embodied Cheyenne Bodie so completely that the line between character and man began to blur. Audiences saw more than a cowboy. They saw conviction. Week after week, viewers turned on their televisions and found steadiness, justice, and quiet strength. For 8 seasons, Clint carried the show with a presence that needed no grand speeches. Every stare, every gesture held weight. Behind that stoic image was a man fighting to be more than his physique, to be taken seriously beyond the saddle. And yet, the success brought its own quiet burden. Cheyenne was a role that defined him, perhaps too well. Even as the Western genre surged, Clint found himself boxed into a singular mold. The fame grew, but so did the pressure. He wanted more. More roles, more depth, more room to stretch his abilities. The cowboy image, while beloved, began to feel like a cage. Still, he gave everything to it, never letting his audience down. In film, Clint found new ground. He stepped into The Dirty Dozen as Samson Posey, a giant, quiet, and lethal. It was a role that drew on his physical power but offered something deeper. Gentleness, restraint, contradiction. These were not loud performances. They simmered, steady and full of tension. In westerns like Yellowstone Kelly and Night of the Grizzly, Clint continued to dominate the screen with quiet charisma. But the fight for variety never left him. He pushed into guest roles and voice work, quietly resisting the industry's urge to flatten him into a single shape. Off camera, he was just as grounded. There were no public scandals, no messy headlines. Instead, there were personal trials, the kind that left no trace on the screen but weighed heavily in real life. He endured loss, heartbreak, and moments that demanded a different kind of strength. In 1971, a near-fatal skiing accident nearly ended everything. A ski pole pierced his heart. He was pronounced dead. But then, against all odds, he came back. That recovery wasn't just physical. It was a quiet triumph of will. Tragedy marked other parts of his life as well. His only daughter, Valerie, brought him immense pride, but her tragic motorcycle accident would leave a wound that never fully closed. Still, Clint stood tall. He moved through grief the same way he moved through fame, with dignity and silence. His marriages, too, told a story of searching for peace. With Vera Garver, he built the early foundation of family and watched Valerie grow into one of the first female airline pilots in the country. That marriage ended after 20 years, but the bond of parenting held. His second wife, Giselle, brought calm into his life just as he began stepping away from Hollywood's demands. Their time together, though eventually cut short by her passing in 1994, was filled with quiet companionship. Clint bore that loss the same way he had borne others, privately with grace. And when he found Susan Cavallari, it wasn't about glamour. It was about steadiness. Their marriage became a quiet sanctuary that carried him into his later years. Still, even peace had its shadows. The rivalry between Clint and James Garner lingered beneath the surface. Two men, both icons of the Western genre, but shaped by opposite ideals. Garner, outspoken and rebellious, often clashed with the discipline and loyalty that Clint held close. Publicly, they shared a studio and a fan base. Privately, the distance grew. Garner's dismissive comments, reduced to nothing more than a body, a frame, cut deeper than Clint ever admitted. Friends said he rarely spoke of Garner, but the disdain was unmistakable. In a world filled with make-believe, Clint's values were real. Professionalism, unity, quiet respect. He couldn't stand the arrogance. He didn't need the chaos. That grudge lasted years, not out of ego, but out of principle. And still, even as the industry changed, even as the Western faded from primetime, Clint remained. At fan conventions, in quiet letters to admirers, in every handshake and memory, he stayed connected. The journey had been long. The spotlight had dimmed. But the man, the values, remained steadfast. Fame gave Clint Walker recognition, but it never changed the core of who he was. Still, the world around him wasn't always kind. Beneath the calm surface of his public image, there was a lifelong battle. One not with scandal, but with being misunderstood. For years, he had worked to prove he was more than a broad-shouldered cowboy. He wanted the industry to see him not as a figure of strength, but as a man of depth. Yet Hollywood rarely looked past the exterior. The studio machinery was relentless, and the comparisons were constant. One name, one presence, one rivalry lingered most of all: James Garner. At Warner Brothers, they were both rising stars, placed side by side not as colleagues, but as competitors. Garner, charismatic and quick-witted, rebelled openly. He sued the studio, fought back, and reveled in the attention. Clint took another path, one of discipline, patience, and quiet loyalty. But in silence, the tension grew. The press played it up, the studios encouraged it, and behind the scenes, the divide deepened. Garner called him a muscle man, dismissed his work, undermined what Clint had built with steady hands and earnest effort. The comments weren't just flippant. They struck at the very thing Clint had spent years trying to escape. That he was just a body, just a face. That all the pain, discipline, and emotional control meant nothing. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't pride. It was the heartbreak of not being seen for what he truly was. He never responded publicly, never entered the fray. But those close to him knew, the resentment was real. Rare for a man like Clint, who avoided bitterness and walked through life with measured grace. But James Garner had carved out a wound, and it never fully healed. Not because of ego but because of values. Clint believed in honoring the work, in respecting the people who helped build it. Garner, to Clint, represented everything that fractured that belief. And yet, through it all, he never lost sight of the audience. He knew who he was serving. The fans. The families. The quiet ones looking for strength in the dark. While Garner lit up red carpets and interviews, Clint wrote letters, attended conventions, smiled for photos even when his heart was tired. He stayed connected, not for attention, but for meaning. That connection was the truest part of his legacy. Outside the spotlight, Clint's real world was marked by profound love and staggering loss. His daughter, Valerie, had grown into a trailblazer in her own right. One of the first female airline pilots in the United States, she carried forward the quiet strength of her father. But tragedy came in the form of a motorcycle accident. Sudden, brutal, and irreversible. For a man who had lived through so much, this loss carved deeper than any rival's insult. He carried the grief not as a burden, but as a quiet shadow that followed him for the rest of his life. His marriages told another story. One not of Hollywood headlines, but of loyalty and endurance. Vera, his first wife, had been there from the beginning. Through the rise, the fame, and the changing tides. Their paths eventually split, but their bond through Valerie never faded. His second marriage, to Giselle, brought him a season of peace, something steadier, more anchored. Her passing in 1994 was another private blow. And then came Susan. With her, he found a final rhythm. Not glamorous. Not loud. Just lasting. Their life together was one of shared silences, steady routines, and a sense of being understood. Even in his later years, Clint remained connected to his roots. He returned often to fan gatherings, always ready with a handshake and a memory. He answered letters, signed photographs, and listened more than he spoke. There was something grounding in those moments, a reminder of the life he'd built not on scandal, but on character. The industry had moved on. The Western genre faded from primetime. But Clint Walker didn't need the spotlight anymore. What remained was something stronger than fame, reputation. Through every loss, every rivalry, every near-death moment and public slight, Clint stood firm. His relationship with his twin sister Lucille was one of the quiet pillars of his life. Born on the same day, raised side by side, they remained close until her passing in 2000. That bond was never part of the headlines, but it shaped him just the same. Family wasn't decoration for Clint. It was everything. When he looked back on his life, it wasn't the applause or the screen time that defined it. It was the stillness. The quiet victories. The people who stood beside him, and the values that never wavered. Clint Walker passed away just days before his 91st birthday, closing a chapter that had stretched across nearly a century of American memory. The cause was congestive heart failure, but the decline had been quiet, like much of his private life. By then the cameras had long gone dark, the studios had shifted focus, and the westerns that once ruled television had faded into nostalgia. Still, Clint remained. Not on the screen, but in the memories he left behind. He had lived long enough to see his legacy take shape. Not in the roles alone, but in the way people spoke his name. He was survived by his daughter Valerie, his third wife Susan, a half-sister, and a grandson. But what survived most of all was the impression he left. Solid, unwavering, and deeply human. His bond with Valerie endured throughout both their lives, a quiet thread of resilience connecting father and daughter. Her own journey, marked by early milestones in aviation, mirrored the steady determination Clint had carried all his life. And with Susan by his side in those final decades, Clint found rest. Not in retreat, but in reflection. He had weathered storms the public never saw. The loss of his daughter. The grief of losing Lucille, his twin sister, in 2000 after more than 70 years of shared life. The bitterness of being reduced to muscles instead of recognized for craft. And still, Clint never lashed out. He never chased revenge or spotlight. He simply kept going. His presence at fan conventions well into old age wasn't about clinging to relevance. It was about honoring connection. Those moments, brief but heartfelt, kept him rooted. As others turned their backs on the genre that made them, Clint leaned in. He stayed close to those who remembered. He shook hands with people who had grown up watching him, who had named their children after Cheyenne, who remembered the values his characters stood for. These weren't just roles. They were messages. Embodied. Repeated. Carried forward. Clint Walker remained loyal, to his fans, to his image, and most of all, to himself. Even in the face of a fading spotlight, he never wavered. His legacy was built slowly, almost deliberately, over a life of choices shaped more by restraint than impulse. Clint never rushed his moments. He let things unfold. Whether facing down a rival's insult or standing alone on a studio backlit, he stayed true to his path. The man behind the cowboy hat wasn't performing. He was living out the values he had always held close. Decency. Integrity. Humility. When the world shifted, he didn't scramble to catch up. He simply stood firm. And in doing so, he became something rare in the world of entertainment. Consistent. Unmoved by fame's highs or its collapses. Through every chapter, young drifter, television star, grieving father, devoted husband, he carried the same quiet strength. In the end, that's what people remembered. Not the size of his roles but the depth of his presence. Not the volume of his voice, but the steadiness of his silence. There were no dramatic final words, no sweeping farewell. Just a quiet exit, as fitting as the man himself. Clint Walker left behind a legacy without scandal, without spectacle. He lived as he acted, with restraint, clarity, and depth. His story became a mirror for values now often lost in noise. The calm in the chaos. The steady in the storm. And as the years go by, the echo of Cheyenne Bodie still lingers, not just on the screen, but in the hearts of those who watched him ride across dusty landscapes with honor in his eyes. Clint's journey began in hardship and ended in peace, shaped by trials and carried by a personal code that never bent. That chapter may be over, but it shaped everything. And in the quiet spaces where memory holds firm, his legacy continues, unrushed, undiminished, and deeply remembered.